Hello, and welcome to The Source Within with Chloe Petalino, where I share the source within me with hopes it sparks the source within thee. Hello, and welcome to The Source Within with Chloe Petalino. Today, we are going to jump back into talking about how did we end up here? How did we get here? Last episode, we talked about the creation and God and creation and how things initially started with God having initial thought of what they could become, then developing into these spherical like shapes into the Elohim. And then today we're going to talk about how did we go from there, from these big blobs of shapeless form of these Elohim creatures to then planet Earth and then to us as humans. So that's what we're going to get into today. Now, why don't we know all of this? Just to preface, we don't know all of this. One, because we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of years ago, if not millions to some extent. And so we have limited kind of information that has persisted since the beginning of those times and since this occurred. And then on top of that, a lot of this information was hidden or kept secret essentially by the powers that be, which were the church at the time, starting in 2000 years ago. So what Mythbusters do we have here? Mythbusters we have here today are, by the way, we are not the only species. We are not the only species in the galaxy or universe, and we have never been the only beings in existence, and we are still not the only beings or species in existence today. Yes, there are what we consider aliens, but yes, there are other beings and living species that live and exist on other planets that are intelligent, very highly intelligent beings. For me, it's almost weird to call these things aliens because what I perceive as aliens are these like green blobs of beings, right? With the weird eyes and the big kind of oval, like inverted oval head, or I guess it's like a teardrop shape, but upside down. Anyways, but these are the beings that I guess I will be referring to in here. And yeah, also by the way, y'all, Atlantis was real. So that's what we're going to be checking into today. And those are the Mythbusters for today. Let's start by setting an intention. Take a deep breath. Bring yourself to the moment. Open up the space in your mind and being. And I would like to remain open to what I hear in this episode. Please release me of any ties or bonds or ways of the 3D world that get in the way from me knowing and understanding and seeing these alternative perspectives and more of the truth about our existence, and help me to understand and process this information in a way that is helpful to my well-being and my journey going forward. As always, thank you so much to any higher and illumined light beings that are here to assist us and with us during this episode today and this ongoing journey of spiritual development and growth. Thank you so much. Now, a little bit of context in history before this. Then the first time I heard some of this information, and a lot of it came from Matthias de Stefano, who is himself a philosopher and has a series called Initiation on the Gaia Network. And he is known for remembering. Essentially, he remembers these previous existences he had, one of which was during the times of Atlantis. And he heard stories from his grandfather that then gave him this information about more of the history of the universe and of planet Earth and how humans got here, etc. So a lot of this information comes from there. However, there's other parts of this information that actually, that do exist in the Bible. However, it is information that either has been changed or altered or to have a different meaning than maybe than it was initially intended to have. And also, you know, there's also been more of a coming out of I would call, I consider it almost like this collective consciousness awakening ish in some ways, where people at the same times but in different places are starting to either notice or recognize or remember or have information about or receive higher knowing about similar topics, but having no other connection, no other way of communicating the knowledge that they have gained. And so it's kind of like this idea of simultaneous inventions and ideas. Like, there's something to that. So, for example, like in the 1600s, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz both discovered calculus, like at the same time, but in totally different areas of the world. In the 1800s, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace both described natural selection. Also, like, again, at the very similar time frames, but totally different places in the world. And of course, at that time, you couldn't communicate virtually like we can do now. Also, 1950s, Jonas Salk and Albert Bruce Sabin invented the polio vaccine. Again, different locations on the planet that kind of came into this knowingness. So I'm using these examples actually to compare them to Atlantis, because I've noticed in the past years, and more so, there's been more of a bringing up, there's been more of a rumbling about Atlantis. Is it really real? Is it not really real? What's going on there? But there's been more of kind of like this collective awakening, might not be the right term, this collective wondering, curiosity about our prior civilizations and our prior existences as humans on Earth. And one of those fascinations really seems to be about Atlantis. And so and to me, when I hear that and I notice and observe that there is multiple simultaneous curiosities about the same topic, to me that stands out, and it's okay, this is something to pay attention to, this is something to wonder about, this is something that maybe we as a collective, as humans, etc., that we are meant to be starting to remember, are meant to be discussing, are meant to be exploring more of, etc. So really, when I first heard this information, it was from this initiation. To the extent that I heard it, the first time I heard it, to the extent of the history and understanding of ancient Atlantis and of how we got here, was really through initiation on the Gaia network. So as we go back to the beginning of creation and God and the beginning of creation, as we did in the last episode, we'll recall that at the beginning, really, there were only Elohim, and those were these big spherical kind of shapes. And the Elohim were the will of the God and a will of the universe and of God to know itself, to create life, so that through evolution and experiencing different aspects of itself, it could start to know itself better and could start to learn about itself. But it took billions of years for the species of humans that we are today to evolve. It's not like all of a sudden humans just existed. The first species were not like humans at all. In fact, the first beings in the universe were actually what we call the five bodies, or the four elements. And the four elements, including water, earth, fire, and air, or gas. And then the fifth being ethereal, an ethereal body that connects to everything. We consider it maybe a spirit self. So at the beginning, there were really just these 4 to 5 elements in existence in the universe. And so what happened was, when the Big Bang occurred, when all of the energy was going around and around and around each other, the first one became the two. The two, by the positive and negative, started going around each other in concentric circles at a very high rate, splitting into the 3. And once it splits into the 3, then the 3 continues to split into more and more and more. And eventually that pressure of this ever expanding being would would go out really wide and then contract, meaning go into itself at the very middle and then out and then in. And by that process, by that movement, what have you, the Big Bang occurred, which is these formless beings developed into formed existences, formed shapes and forms. And the first creations really started to become the planets and become the stars. The light from consciousness started to be develop into stars and planets. And essentially, initially, there were thousands and thousands of beings, but of all the beings, bacteria was the most important, because the bacteria created structures, and from those structures, all species essentially were created. So the first beings were created when the galaxies and planets were created, but again, they weren't like we were today. The first beings, were like Jupiter and Saturn, for example, were made of combinations of fire and gas. Those were some of the first beings in existence. 4.6 billion years ago, the moon crashed with Earth. That's when the Pleiades were formed, another star cluster. And those also are beings and are another species. So essentially, we have these four elements, and the four elements then developed all the rest of kind of creation and existence from that. There were planets that were built, and the planets were being populated by other species. There were very intelligent species, and there are species that lived on other planets and still do, that have their own societies and have their own societies. There are other species that have their own societies, and actually they developed societies before because they saw societies as being reflective of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So they wanted basically a visualization of that, because they wanted to be able to evolve themselves into even more intelligent beings. And these intelligent beings from outside of the planet, they understood more about the dimensions. And part of, I'm not going to get too complicated into this because it is complicated, and this will need other dedicated episodes. But essentially, they understood that in order for them to get to higher dimensions of consciousness, higher dimensions of being and existence, which they were seeking, they needed to go through the third dimension, basically planets such as Earth, or the third dimension, in order to get to other dimensions that were much higher in existence. So again, I'll go up more on that later, but I do want to highlight here that these other species, both in existence now and that were historically in existence, they had this higher intelligence. They knew much more than I'll say as talking about the general public, the general population on our planet now. They had much higher and much more advanced understanding of the galaxy and the universe and God and all of these things and how they worked, much more advanced than we do currently. And so what happened was, when Earth was formed, several other beings from other planets, other species, started coming to Earth and started kind of checking it out. And they started preparing what they considered preparing the Earth for species or for beings being able to inhabit it. And what they did is essentially bring kind of information about the cosmos, about the universe to the Earth and integrate it into the Earth. About 1 million years ago, when the Ice Age occurred, that's when the first Homo sapiens were just first being created. And it was the off-planet beings. I'm going to say off-planet beings instead of aliens. So off-planet species or beings realized that humans were going to be the chosen species and the capable, not only the chosen, but also the capable species of activating the knowledge of the planet. So because of this, these species started coming to Earth and started preparing humans, or at least the most early forms of humans, to be aware of ourselves. And they also wanted to give us tools so that we could evolve, and we could evolve at a faster rate than their species were essentially able to. And so over time of coming to the planet, they taught the earliest humans much about existence and how we could reach our fullest and highest potentials. So the first beings that came to the planet were called the Nemnir. And they were the first civilization from other galaxies, mind you, not our galaxy. There's multiple galaxies as well. So from other galaxies that came to the US. And they were giants, enormous beings, and they lived in the ice, in the cold. They needed the ice and the cold. And in fact, eventually they ended up leaving our planet Earth, because our planet was too warm for them. But what they did when they came to Earth is they put information, and again, information about the universe, the galaxies, they put this information in the water, because water or ice is the one element that can hold and transmit information through time and space. It's like water's like the only element that can persist and live basically through time and space. So they put the information of the universe and our existence and creation into the water, with this idea that when it would be consumed, and also we are predominantly water beings, mind you, as well, but when we consume, we would remember, and we would start realizing and knowing this grander information and what we were actually part of on a much larger scale, on a collective universal scale. They also, the Nemnir they gave the first DNA to move us towards being Homo sapiens sapiens. So that was where that first initial DNA came from. And at this time, humans on the planet, were primarily hunting and gathering. And at those times, they were inhabiting essentially northern Europe, Siberia, and Antarctica. They also taught us how to store seeds of plants. And that is what allowed us to create villages and civilizations, so that we no longer had to be necessarily nomadic. We could learn how to plant and seed ourselves. So these were some of the highlights, and very important, of the Nemnir that were the first civilization, again, from other galaxies to come to Earth. So the Nemnir eventually left because the heat of the planet was too much. Then about 500,000 years ago, the Sophia came to planet Earth. Now the Sophia are human in figure. They appear human in figure, but they are reptilian. And they came to the wilderness areas on Earth. They came to Africa, the Middle East, Central Americas, Australia, and Southeast Asia. And they were searching for humans or a species that could hold the information of the whole universe. And they determined that was women. So women were so they taught women everything. They taught women how to transform, like how to work with the plants, how to work with seeds. They taught them about the secrets of the universe. They understand how to transform and develop with this idea of seeds. Also, this was, yes, on the earthly plane, but this was also parallel, I guess I would say parallel in the spiritual aspects of what do we mean by a seed, and then how do you develop or grow. So there was more extent to that. And so women really were the first shamans that existed in our world and on our planet. They were the first ones who knew about the concept of alchemy, and they were the first priests, quote unquote, but they were priestesses that existed on the planet. And so the initial knowing of the information of a lot of the most profound ancient teachings and universal practices, this also includes the principles of the universe, how things work, that was women. And the Sophia taught women how to rule the world, basically. Well, with all of these skills and these tools that they were taught. And so the women ended up teaching men how to use these and how to rule, and then men did eventually rule the world. And the Sophia are present because you'll see all of, these are reflected. So, we see the temples, we see the Egyptian temples, or we see the motifs in the Aztecs and the Mayans, etc. And we try to make understanding about what the motifs or what the images are, etc. So much of what is there, when we have more of a background and more of an understanding of our development of a species and of a planet, we start piecing things together and realizing that this symbology, we start realizing what those symbols actually mean. And so, for example, for the Sophia, they are represented in snakes that you see on certain motifs on temples and in pyramids. And those were put there by the ancient humans in honor of the Sophia. They saw the Sophia, they saw these beings as godlike beings. They came from elsewhere off planet, and then helped humanity by instilling and giving and teaching all of this wisdom that we would have no other way of knowing, at least at that point in time. We were a brand new, species. What the Sophia also did very profoundly was showed us the path of the snake on Earth, the snake on the planet, which is the kundalini of the planet, which is essentially the energy of the planet, also known as the consciousness of the planet. And yes, plants and animals and humans and planets all have consciousness. Again, I'll go into that much more in other episodes, but for the purposes of here, essentially, it's quite important that the Sophia taught us about this snake and the kundalini of the planet, and it exists and where it flows, which starts in Greenland and goes all the way down through to Patagonia in Argentina and Chile. So a lot of teaching came from the initial Sophia. Then about 200,000 years ago, the Alithir, also known as the Mu, arrived. And they primarily situated themselves in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. They settled in Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. So we know that is quite a triangle there where they were settling. And they came with their intention was to calibrate the water, which they considered it was the blood of the planet, and to put more of the information from the outside universe, galaxy, what have you, into the planet from off planet. And then they were supposed to be here to then protect this knowledge that was in the water and the ocean. Now, also, there were portals on Earth. So, and I'm not trying to get too wild here with saying all this kind of stuff, but just to mention, so basically there are different portals on the Earth that are energetic portals. They can be used to get to other dimensions or off planet, we can say. And so they were also here to guard some of these portals. They also were here to contribute to the DNA of humanity. And in fact, it was part and through their presence here that the Australians, the initial natives in Australia, were really the first to understand about the consciousness of the planet. And so this was more teaching. Now, the Sophia as well did talk about the path of the snake, which is the consciousness of the planet. So potentially they both did, but there was more understanding basically in development about consciousness of the planet and the importance of that. And the idea is that they knew that there was something between humans being a successful species and reaching our full developed ascended potentials and needing to know and work with the planet consciousness on which we lived in order for us to become more enlightened beings. So in 50,000 BC, the Nemnir came back. Those were the giants that were like the ice giants. And they came back and they created Lemuria. Now, I'm not going deep into Lemuria here either, but I'm just kind of going through the broad strokes of this history and how off-planet beings came to Earth and how and what they taught us as a species, and then how we kind of developed as a species. So 20,000 years ago, the Aesir, also known as Anunnaki, came to Earth. Now, there's differences in terms of time frame here. 20,000 BC is what I gathered from initiation by Matthias de Stefano on Gaia. In just general Google searches, I saw something about 500,000 years ago. I don't know. I don't know exactly, but I'm just going to continue with these time frames. And, we likely will never know exactly all of the time frames, but hopefully this is giving a little bit of a framework of a linear time frame that we can wrap our heads around in our 3D, ways of thinking. So the Anunnaki came, and I want to reflect to you again that this isn't just coming out of nowhere. The Anunnaki, they have been referenced in the Old Testament. They've also been referenced in ancient Sumerian texts, which are some of the oldest texts we really have in existence. So, and they also were giants. So we have the Nemnir that were giants, and then we also have the Anunnaki who were also giants, and they're referred to as giants in the Old Testament. These beings came here because their planet was essentially dying, and they needed a new home. Well, twofold. I mean, they came to this planet because their planet was dying. So one thing that they did was come to our planet because we had minerals, and they were trying to extract minerals from our planet to bring back to their planet to save it. So that was one way. So they're mining like gold and other minerals to save their planet. And at the same time, I think they were trying to save it, and that wasn't not working, essentially. And so they also came to planet Earth with a thought of, okay, are we going to start a new civilization here because they lost theirs? So there's mixed, were they all good? Were they all bad? The Anunnaki, there's mixed reports. And I think probably both were true, which was there were some Anunnaki who were fully wanting to support humanity and its evolution, and there were other Anunnaki who exploited humanity and procreated with humanity to then have slaves to then help them with mining for the minerals that they wanted to bring back to their planet. So it was mixed. I think that's the most accurate way to say it, just as there's all, people who are, for and against it. And all species are not good or bad. These sorts of things. It's not binary. It's not all duality. So anywho, Anunnaki though, so they came to our planet. Now, they settled predominantly in the Middle East, in Arabia, as it was called at that time, Iraq and Oman. And so they settled actually at the heart of the snake, which was in the Kundalini of the planet. Now, each of these places, keep in mind, settled in different areas of the kind of consciousness and Kundalini energy of the planet. Now, they created a hybrid species with Homo erectus at that time. They were our first relatives to have a kind of a human-like body. The Homo erectus was our first relatives that had like a human-type body proportions with shorter arms and longer legs. And the time, whenever this was, that they actually created this hybrid species, they were wanting to seed civilization and to settle on Earth and to transmit their blood and to the Earth and to transmit their information to our planet. So from the Anunnaki creating these hybrid species with this Homo erectus that then developed more into like the humans that we are today. They were really the first that created what then became the Atlanteans. And the Atlanteans are known as, quote, the sons of the first people born of those from stars and from earth. Again, the Atlanteans were the sons of the first people born of those from the stars and from earth. So essentially, we had the first people who were born of the stars, which would be the Anunnaki, and the earthly, the Homo sapien erectus. And then we have that first generation, and then that second generation, the children of that first hybrid species became essentially what we think of as the first idea of what civilization would look like on Earth. Now, around 16,000 BC, this is when they started to populate, let's say, the Anunnaki, now developing more into what we might call the Atlanteans, started to be able to populate in the Canary Islands and the Green Cape. And that was the center, really, of the Atlantean Empire. And what happened from there, we'll talk about the first war that ever existed on our planet, and essentially how subsequent wars are all stem from that one. We'll also talk about civilizations that then came out of Atlantis and how that had transitioned throughout the world. It will also talk about an introduction of Hermes Thoth Trismegistus, Hermes Thoth Trismegistus, who was an Atlantean and then ended up settling in Egypt. And he is the founder, the author of the Principles of the Universe. He's the author of the Kabbalion and the Hermetic Principles, which essentially are principles of the universe that we will also get into and discuss more of. So excited to get into all of that with you next time. Thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate your open-mindedness in hearing all of this. And if your mind is blown, like that emoji that like has the face with the and then the brain looks like it's kind of like exploding out of its head, that's what I would describe when I first realized, okay, whoa, that is pretty amazing that we came from these like big blobs of no form at all to then becoming formed, to then having all of these off-planet beings come and like very thoughtfully and intentionally try to develop both our planet and humans as a species. And wow. So much, so amazing, so cool. Very excited, and talk to you next time.